And go.
There we go. Okay, welcome everybody. We've got 32 people viewing today. I think this is fantastic. See, the idea of coming to a tea party did it. We really like our tea party. You all know the way this runs. Charlene is going to introduce our speaker in just a couple of minutes, and we'll have a marvelous tea party. At the end of it, there will be questions. Again, just to remind you, when question time comes, raise your hand, leave it up so that Hank can see you, or get your bottom chat and you could type a message to him, or hit the raise hand and just have it automatically raised. Just leave it up until he finds you and calls on you. At the end of the meeting, after we have finished all of our questions, if you want to stay around a little bit afterwards, we'll leave the link open for a little while in case you want to have chat after the meeting or after the speech of the meeting. So now, if we could have Charlene introduce us our new speaker for the day, please. You're up, Charlene.
Okay.
Oh, you've got an echo.
All right, I think we're on. Why is there an echo? Once is enough. Good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to see all of you, and I hope you have your cup of tea. And I know I do right here in a lovely teacup. Always tastes better in a teacup. So we're delighted you are joining in, and we have today as our speaker, Claire Hopley. Claire was born and grew up in Chester in the north of England. Since moving to the US, she has always lived in Massachusetts, mostly Amherst and Leverett, for over 40 years. She taught for a while at Mount Holyoke College and UMass, and also taught writing in Poland and Greece. Claire has always liked to travel and to read. Her book on tea grew from the numerous tea drinking scenes in English novels and plays. She wanted to explore what these scenes revealed about the social impact of tea, and conversely, what the economic development of tea could tell us about the implications of literary tea times. That, she hoped, would be the title of the book, but the publisher panicked and decided a more all-encompassing title, which became The History of Tea, would be better. Claire has also written 4 other books about culinary history and food, including one on Christmas food. She has written numerous articles on food and some also on travel and contemporary novels. So I'd like to introduce Claire Hopley, and grab your teacup and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. I wish I could see you in person, but I think this is, I hope, a good second best. I am going to be talking about tea today and touching on as many points as I can, but of course there's lots more that could be said. So if perhaps you have questions, I might be able to answer them at the end. Okay, apart from water, tea is the most widely drunk beverage in the world. I guess that it helps that it comes from China, which has a population of literally billions of people who bump up the number of tea drinkers. India is another populous nation of tea drinkers, and there are millions more tea drinkers in famous tea drinking countries such as Britain and Russia. And then there are nations where tea is very popular, but they're not particularly famous for it. We hear about Turkish coffee, but not really about Turkish tea. And yet it's a major drink in Turkey, and Turkey is also a significant tea producing, tea growing country. Tea is grown, the people in Poland, Portugal, in the Netherlands are also serious tea drinkers. And if we look at tea consumption per capita rather than the numbers of people who are drinking it, for example, in very densely populated countries in China, two small countries top the list of the world's highest per capita tea drinking, and they are New Zealand and Ireland. Britain is about third in that list. How did this come about? The tea plant is a kind of camellia. Its Latin name is Camellia sinensis, which means literally Chinese camellia. And it comes from the Himalayan part of China because it likes growing in cool but not freezing hills where there's a lot of rain. And so that's in the provinces of Sichuan and Yunnan, which border on Vietnam and Myanmar. China was then the first country that we know where tea was first drunk, and that literally is thousands of years ago. So I'm going to begin by telling you a Chinese myth about the origins of tea. Once there was an extraordinary emperor called Shen Nung. A lot of Chinese histories date the beginning of their history with Shen Nung. And he knew everything, apparently, especially about agriculture and medicine. He drank nothing but boiled water. One day in 2737 BCE, he was sitting in a beauty spot in the mountains. A breeze was wafting around and it blew some leaves and they floated right down into a pot of boiling water that his servants was preparing for him. The emperor drank the liquid and he found it deliciously invigorating. Of course, it was a tea bush that had let its leaves drop, and he'd discovered a fantastic drink. He wrote in his medical book, "Tea quenches thirst. It lessens the desire for sleep. In other words, it will keep you awake. It gladdens and cheers the heart." Note that these qualities refer to health, to the body. And as history went on, Chinese often emphasized the health benefits of tea. A 4th century AD Chinese dictionary explained that it could improve eyesight and dispel, I quote, noxious gases. Certain kinds of tea, as this is today, pu'er in particular, is believed to help keep you slim. I've had Chinese people tell me that the reason why Cantonese people are slim is because that's all they drink, pu'er tea. That's spelled rather an odd way, P-U apostrophe E-R-H. One of the traditional qualities that everybody points out about tea is that it deals with lethargy. And so, as you know, when you go into a Chinese restaurant, the first thing you get is a cup of tea. It's a restorative, and our word restaurant comes from the same root as that. So that tradition of tea being a restorative is a very long continuing one. And like most drinks, tea is a little bit addictive. If you like drinking tea, you'll probably drink quite a lot of it. An 8th century Chinese text quotes another emperor as saying, "The use of tea grows upon me surprisingly. I know not how, but it is my fancy, it is awakened, and my spirits are exhilarated as if by wine." Tea arrived in Japan from China in the late 8th century, and it was imported by the Chinese Emperor Shoumu specifically to give to a monastery of Buddhist monks to help them keep awake while contemplating. So again, we get the emphasis on tea keeping you awake. Like the Chinese, the Japanese have a story about the origin of tea. It tells us that Daruma, the founder of Buddhism, known more widely, I think, as Dharma, but the Japanese word is daruma, advocated very, very long hours of contemplation and set an example for monks by staying awake himself. But one day he fell asleep while he was contemplating, meditating, and was so disgusted with himself that he vowed never to let this happen again. So he took a razor and cut off his eyelids and threw them into the bushes. And where they landed, 2 bushes grew. And as you can guess, they turned out to be tea bushes. Now, this is a tough, even masochistic story. I wish you could have seen Charlene's face when I said he cut his eyelids off. But anyway, it's got a modern follow-up. People in Japan now often buy, can you see this? Is this visible? This is papier-mâché figures. They can be smaller than this. They can also be a lot larger. And when you buy them, the eyes are white. And these eyes on this one were white till this morning when I was practicing for this lecture. And then I did what Japanese people do. When they make a wish, they put an eye into one eye place. And then they keep working towards their wish. And if their wish is granted, they fill in the other one. Unfortunately, I did it with an indelible thing, so I can't take it out and demonstrate that for you. Japanese politicians sometimes show themselves writing in one eye when they announce that they're up for election, and then filling in the other eye in front of their constituency when they get elected. Also, modern time management experts have used this technique when they're telling people how to complete a project. They suggest you draw yourself a daruma or something similar without the eyes. You fill in one eye when you begin your project, but you can't fill in the other one until your project is complete. Between them, the Japanese and the Chinese really came up with a lot of epithets for wine, for tea. And the difference in these epithets and in the ways that over the centuries they've written about it exemplify a big difference between the Chinese and the Japanese approach to tea. The Chinese approach is this restorative, healthful approach, and that's very long established. The Japanese have a more aesthetic, contemplative approach. And again, that perhaps comes from its introduction to Japan via monasteries. Among the epithets that they used to call it are precious dew, queen of the camellias, because it comes from the camellia plant, of which there's many varieties. Wine of the poor, because in those countries it is cheap and it has, as the emperor noted, some of the effects of wine. And a recent American poet, a 20th century American poet called Arthur Dobrin, wrote a poem using some of these terms, and I'm going to read it to you. Which to believe? The eyes of a holy man falling to the earth and sprouting, or a leaf silently descending into an emperor's cup? I consider this question, sipping one day precious spring jade, another precious dew. I pour the queen of camellias, look out of my window at the rustling bamboo, and breathe in the steam from a blue cup. Drink slowly this exotic brew, this wine of the poor. Notice there that he specifies he's drinking from a blue cup. By the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, Chinese as well as Japanese writings were writing a lot about tea. And one of the most important of them was called Lu Yang. And he did have a somewhat Japanese approach to this, more aesthetic. He believed all tea should be drunk from a blue porcelain cup. I absolutely agree about the porcelain, but not about the blue, because I drink tea with milk, and I think it looks much better in white cup or a colored cup, colored on the outside and white on the inside. But of course, Chinese and Japanese people drink tea without milk. And so if you gaze down to the liquid, you know, the clear liquid in a blue cup without milk, perhaps the blue cups are better. Tea quickly, well, not very quickly, I suppose, but tea traveled to many other countries. And some of the earliest were Russia, Turkey, Afghanistan, because they could take the overland route from China, the route that we now know as the Silk Road. To make it easier to transport, and it was carried on the backs of men who literally walked thousands of miles with it. To make it easier to transport, it was compressed into bricks. And the way of using it then was to shave off some of the brick and put it in a cup or a pot and pour boiling water on it. That is quite rare nowadays, although sometimes you can see tea bricks in food museums or tea museums. But they are still used because this way of getting tea is quite useful for nomadic peoples of Central Asia, where that first developed. Tea didn't make it into Western Europe until the 16th century, and it was brought by the Portuguese because they were the ones who pioneered the route from Western Europe around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and up the Indian Ocean and across to China. And they were interested in importing silks, spices, anything they took a fancy to, and one of these was tea, and that's going to become relevant to us in a little while. In 1600 in Britain and in 1602 in Holland, there were established two companies that survived for a long time and had a very important impact. One was the East India Company, which was British. The other was the Dutch East India Company. The British were mostly focused on India, which at that time did not grow tea. So it was 1650 before they got themselves to China and brought back tea to England. In 1657, there was the first advertisement for tea, and it was actually offered in a coffee shop in Oxford, which is still there today in the High Street. Coffee arrived in Western Europe, or Northwestern Europe anyway, at about the same time as tea, and so did chocolate, which was then always served as a drink, not as a confection. So in that one decade, the 1650s, 3 brown drinks from tropical places arrived in Western Europe, and they made very significant and dramatic differences to people. In England and also in Massachusetts a few years later, starting in the 1670s, it was always drunk in coffee houses, not tea houses. The word for coffee house has now changed to the French word, we call them cafes, where you can still get tea and coffee and other drinks, not just tea. One of these coffee houses was owned by a man in London called Thomas Twining. And like the other ones, he served coffee and tea, but he decided he was doing better with tea. So when he got prosperous enough to open a second one, he called it the Golden Lion. It's on the Strand in London and he still sells tea. It's Thomas Twining, and as you probably know, Twinings is a very big brand, one that's very easy to buy in this country as well. But the original tea house is still there on the Strand in rather a dramatic position, actually, because it's opposite the Royal Law Courts, which are themselves a very handsome building. Now, considering that in the circumstances of 17th century England, there was no TV, There was no big billboards. There were newspapers, which certainly carried advertisements, but they were not all over the place. So tea took off dramatically quickly, really. And I'll just review some of the reasons for that. One is that in 1660, Charles II, who had been living in France while the Puritans had killed his father, Charles I, and had been in power for 10 years. 1660, Charles II came back, and with him, after the Puritan rule, when all things were plain and a lot of things were forbidden, Charles II brought lots of good, luxurious things with him. He was called a happy monarch. His wife was Catherine of Braganza. Braganza is a province in Portugal, and part of her dowry, remember the Portuguese were big tea drinkers by this time, part of her dowry was a chest of tea. And that was quite a significant item because it took a year for a ship to complete the journey to China, pick up tea, silk, whatever else it was picking up, and get back to Western Europe. So this tea chest was very significant. She brought it to England with her, and she and her Portuguese ladies continued drinking tea. And of course, it then became fashionable with anybody at the court, and that fashion moved down. And tea lends itself very much to this, actually lends itself to this better than coffee does, because you can use the same tea leaves more than one time. So tea could be made for the rich people, and then the pots would go down to the kitchen, and the servants in the kitchen could make another pot of tea using the same leaves, and maybe a third pot even. So in that way, tea quickly sort of reached relatively poor people. And visitors to England in the 18th century would often comment on this, because they would come from countries where tea was very expensive, and they were used to it being such a luxury item. There was no way that an ordinary person could be drinking it. But a Swedish visitor, for example, noted that just ordinary cartmen or ordinary servants were drinking tea, not as a special thing, just as their regular drink. Now that's important, because before the arrival of tea, what was the regular drink? What was the staple drink? All of us drink different things, but most of us drink one thing most of the time. Before tea arrived, the staple drink in England for everybody, rich, poor, young, old, was beer. And there were problems with this. One was that Britain was using half its grain crop to make beer, not to make bread. And the population was growing during this period. So that was sort of unsustainable in itself. Another was the obvious one, that though most beer then was quite low in alcohol, this is what you might remember being referred to by Shakespeare and other writers as small beer. So it was 2 or 3% in alcohol. People were drinking it all day. So obviously it could lead to drunkenness and fatness too. So the Dutch and the English were both known for this one habit, for being drunken and for being fat during this period. And as you'll remember, I mentioned earlier that the Dutch began going to the East and buying tea at about the same time as the English. There really were very few alternatives to beer. Cider was one, but English cider is always alcoholic too, so it didn't solve that problem. And in any case, it's very much, it was then, is now a regional thing. Water wasn't a serious possibility because it was polluted. Milk was considered only fit for children. So when tea came along, and coffee too, and chocolate, they provided a non-alcoholic alternative to beer. And because they were served hot, you could see that they would be popular in a cold country like Britain. The English added milk to tea and often sugar. That was an innovation because the Chinese and the Japanese never did that. The reason why they took to adding milk is not really known, but one speculation is they were in the habit of making alcoholic drinks out of wine or beer or brandy, and warm alcoholic drinks like eggnogs or negus or punch, things like that, and then putting milk in them. So there's one suggestion that at that time, if you had a hot drink, you had it with milk. So that might be the reason why they did it. But at any rate, they did. And that was a particular English innovation. When tea first arrived in the 17th century, it was a new thing. So there was no set time for drinking it. But because it was not alcoholic, it began to be drunk after dinner. Dinner in those days was at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And when it was done, the habit developed of the women going away from the table and drinking tea in another room, while the men got stuck into the hard stuff at the dinner table. And then afterwards, the men would come and join the women, and they would have tea, perhaps with what we would think of as cookies or small pastries and things like that. This was a socially important phenomenon, and it also happened at other mixed gender situations. For example, at card parties or evening parties, or in theatres, people would take tea in their boxes. And in a sense, it made it possible for men and women to get together and converse on kind of what we might think of as reasonable terms, because the men were not necessarily, the women, nobody was necessarily drunk as they might have been before. So it helped develop a kind of a more companionate sense of the relationship between the sexes. So tea is, credited with that innovation. And it very quickly became associated with women. This is not true, or was not true, in China and Japan. All the literature from China and Japan tends to emphasize men, such as monks, drinking tea so they could meditate better, or men like poets or philosophers in China meeting in tea shops and drinking it with conversation. But it quickly did develop this particular relationship with women in England. And I want to give you an example from one of the plays of William Congreve that you might be familiar with because it's its most popular one. It's called The Way of the World. And it features two people, Millamant, a woman, and Mirabeau, a man, both aristocratic, and neither want to get married because each hates the opposite sex. So the play is mostly about machinations to get them married, and then in turn coming on the stage and so, no, I'm never going to do it, basically. But eventually they do decide to get married because they're the only two people in the play with any brains. Eventually, when she agrees to marry him, Millamant says she refuses to dwindle into marriage, that is a quotation, until he meets her demands. And here's another quotation: "To be sole empress of my tea table, which you must never presume to approach without first asking leave." In other words, he can't even come to the tea table. This is how much it is a woman's affair. And Mirabeau acquiesces with provisions that distinguish the tea table from the coffee house. Here's a quote: "To your dominion of the tea table I submit, but restrain yourself to native and simple tea table drinks as tea, chocolate, coffee, and likewise to genuine and authorized tea table talk, such as mending of fashions, spoiling of reputations, railing at absent friends, and so forth. And no account encroach upon the men's prerogative and presume to drink healths or toast fellows, for prevention of which I banish all auxiliaries to the tea table, as orange brandy, all aniseed, cinnamon, citron, and Barbados water together with ratafia." In other words, he's dividing the tea table and what he would think of as gossip, but we as women would think of as normal conversation to women. And he and men are going to drink the alcoholic drinks. So today, most people, I mean, this is after dinner tea he's talking about. Today, most tea drinkers will drink their first cup of tea at breakfast, but until the 19th century, it was not usually served at breakfast, at least not in the fanciest homes, because that was the time for chocolate drinking. So it really stayed on as an after dinner meal. But remember, dinner is still quite early in mid-afternoon, not later than mid-afternoon. So if you think of after dinner, we are thinking of sometime like 4 or 5 o'clock and on into the evening. And many refreshments of small sweet kinds were served with it. But during the 19th century, there was a change. And this was largely because the time for dinner began to move back and ended up being quite late in the evening at about 8 or 9 o'clock. This may seem odd, but it was the result of the Industrial Revolution, when more and more people were working away from home, not just away from the house, but quite a long way away, because they were working in factories or offices. And so breaking for lunch, which had been a small meal in late morning, or breaking for dinner in the middle of the afternoon, was really not a viable option for them. They still had lunch, but now if they had lunch, say at noon, and they were going home and dinner wasn't appearing till 8 o'clock, that was a big wait. And so they wanted to have something to break that wait. Another factor in this, which is also associated with the Industrial Revolution, is new sources of power were being used, particularly gas, which was used to light offices so people could work later, and homes. That meant that people working in the kitchen, which was in the basement of homes, they could see into the early evening, so they could be working into the early evening, making the dinner. In England, it can be dark at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon in winter. That was another reason why dinner had to be early, because somebody had to have enough light to make it. As dinner became a bigger meal, this long wait began to be intolerable, and the Duchess of Bedford is sometimes cited as the inventor of afternoon tea, coming at 4 or 5 o'clock to fill in that gap, because she complained of a sinking feeling in the afternoon and ordered tea and sandwiches to fill this gap, this sinking feeling. So this is where we get our cucumber sandwiches from. And in fact, many other small sandwiches like smoked salmon, egg salad, ham, that would be still served at afternoon tea. Cakes were still, sweet things were still pretty important. I want to read you an example that comes from Queen Victoria's tea times in the middle and late 19th century. A book was published explaining her private life. And quoting from that book, it says, "The refreshing cup of tea has ever ranked high in the royal favor. Her tea time fare followed her around the country." Here's another quotation. "It is principally to supply the Queen's tea table that the confectionery cooks are kept busy all year round at Windsor. For wherever the court may be, there must follow a large supply of cakes. Among the favorites of the Queen, which are carefully packed in small tin boxes and sent to the court 4 times a week, are chocolate sponges, plain sponges, wafers of 2 or 3 shapes, langue de chat, biscuits, drop cakes of all kinds, tablets, petit four, princess and rice cakes, pralines, almond sweets, and a large quantity of mixed sweets. So you see a heavy emphasis here on sweet things rather than on savory things. And that is those 2 quotations, the Duchess of Bedford ordering sandwiches and the Queen having all these cookies and biscuits and little cakes and things, really explains the current traditions of afternoon tea, so that if you travel to England and you go to a hotel or a restaurant for afternoon tea, that is the type of thing you're going to get, the sandwiches and the pastries. Afternoon tea is sometimes confused with high tea. And high tea is something different altogether. If we go back to what I was saying about the Industrial Revolution and more people working in factories and offices, they not only couldn't get back for dinner in the early afternoon, they couldn't get back for afternoon tea in the late afternoon. So when they did come back, they were mad hungry and they had high tea. And high tea is a serious meal with a lot of savory dishes, and it's most, as well as sweet dishes, and it's most similar to what we would call supper now. So sometimes when people visit England, they think, oh, I'll go for high tea. But actually what they really want is afternoon tea, because that's the pretty one with the tiered cake dish and the china cups and everything. I'll read you a couple of descriptions of high tea in the 19th century. One comes from Shirley, a book written by Charlotte Bronte, based in Yorkshire. Curates, 3 curates are coming to visit a family of girls. And this is a special occasion because their parents are hoping that one way or another, these girls will hook up with the curates. So this is the quotation. Yorkshire people in those days took their tea around the table. It was essential to have a multitude of plates of bread and butter, varied in sorts and plentiful in quantity. It was thought proper too that the center plate should stand, in the center plate should stand a glass of marmalade. Among the viands were expected to be found a small assortment of cheesecakes and tarts. And if there was also a plate of thin slices of pink ham garnished with green parsley, so much the better. You see there, that's a lot of food, but still pretty much afternoon tea food. The ham and parsley being the something a little bit more extensive, but still a substantial amount of food. And these curates come and they do indeed tuck in and eat it all up. A more typical high tea is a celebration tea described in Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. I can't remember when it was written, but late 19th or very early 20th century. And this tea was in honor of a couple who just got engaged. The tea, made especially magnificent in honor of the betrothal, was such a meal as could only have been compassed in Staffordshire or Yorkshire. A high tea of the last richness and excellent, exquisitely gracious to the palate, but ruthless in its demands on the stomach. At one end of the table, which glittered with silver, glass, and longshore china, was a fowl which had been boiled for 4 hours. At the other, a hot pork pie, island in liquor, which might have satisfied a regiment. Between these 2 dishes were all the delicacies which differentiate high tea from tea, and on the quality of which the success of the meal really depends. Hot pikelets, hot crumpets, hot toast, sardines with tomatoes, raisin bread, currant bread, seed cake, lettuce, homemade marmalade, and homemade hams. You see there an absolutely massive, overwhelming meal. And in fact, it is a meal which is a literally true description, but in this novel is metaphorically overwhelming also, because the woman who's just got engaged, Anna of the title, is really overwhelmed to have gotten herself into this engagement that she does not actually want to follow through on. There's a lot of other teas that exist in England, or did exist at different times. One I will mention that's also on the Strand in London, like Twining's Tea Shop, is the Savoy Hotel. It's a very fancy hotel there. And it's still a fantastic place to go for tea because the river runs right by its windows. But in the 1920s, the manager of the Savoy fell in love with tango. And so he decided to offer tango teas. At that time, it was quite common for hotels to have an afternoon tea dance in which people, families would come for afternoon tea, and they would have tables around a ballroom, and they would have afternoon tea, but they'd also be able to dance, and they lasted from about 4 to 6 o'clock, sometime like that. So he followed up on that custom with tango teas. Well, in the 1920s, nobody could dance a tango because it was just arriving from Argentina. So he set it up that you could have a tango class and then go to tango dances. So those were his tango teas. So I've talked a little about the social implications for tea and how, in particular, tea became especially connected with women, and also especially connected, especially influential on the relationships between men and women, because at a time when there were not a lot of occasions where young men and women could meet and that still be proper, they could meet at the tea table, or they could meet at a tea dance, or at a theatre where tea might be served. But of course, there was also an enormous economic impact of tea, because as it took off and became so popular, there was a huge trade from Britain, Holland, Portugal, from the western coast of Europe, essentially, a huge trade in the very long journey to China to collect tea. That very much influenced the shipping industry, and it also helped in a way, not totally to create the porcelain industry, but certainly to give it an enormous impetus, because those very same ships that were bringing back tea from China were bringing back China, what we call China porcelain, to drink it out of, because the people who were buying the tea and popularizing it were also bringing back cups and saucers and teapots to use for serving it. And by early in the 17th century, vast amounts of Chinese china were being imported into Western Europe. So that obviously has a huge economic impact. I hope I can find it, a list, an order for one captain, and there's nothing to suggest that this captain is at all unusual, that one captain put in that put into a ship to bring back vast quantities of cups and plates. So, give me a minute, I think I'll be able to find this. No. Well, if I can't find it, I'm sure Charlene will put it on the website for you. One of the reasons why captains were willing to do this was not simply that people wanted to buy the china, it was very handy for them because many of the things that they were bringing back from China, tea itself, silk, spices, are stuff that you shouldn't get wet. So they had to be put in the safest parts of the ship, the highest parts of the ship. So now you've got the high parts of the ships loaded with this stuff. You need something in the low parts of the ship to keep the ballast. And china is very heavy, so the china went in the low parts of the ship, and the lighter materials, the tea itself, and many other lighter luxury products went in the top part of the ship. So that was very handy. But it did another thing too, because all this china, this porcelain, was coming into Europe. Europeans wanted to make their own. Now, they were familiar with porcelain before they were familiar with tea, only because it was often sent to kings or something like that as a gift from, say, a Chinese emperor. But they didn't really have a good idea to make it, and the Chinese were not telling them. So after tea and coffee also, after these drinks became popular, there became a huge push for English, not just English, European producers to produce the china and I keep saying china, which is confusing, to produce the porcelain to make the dishes that people would need. And it really was, it was a battle such as the battle that we've just witnessed of companies trying to produce a COVID vaccine. Companies everywhere were trying to do this. And the people who were promoting it were often the governments. And the one who succeeded was the Elector of Saxony, who had on his staff an alchemist, and he literally imprisoned him. His name was Joseph Butker. He literally imprisoned him until he came up with the formula for mixing clays and feldspar in the right proportions to make the china that you need to drink tea out of. In other words, not pottery, they had pottery before this, but a translucent, thin, translucent china, which would withstand thermal shock. This was important. With pottery, if they made the cups thinner in order to imitate porcelain, and you poured boiling tea in them, they cracked. But you pour boiling tea into a porcelain cup, it won't crack. So the factory that was started then is still a very famous one. It's the Meissen factory near Dresden. Other countries similarly, in Denmark, the king promoted learning how to make porcelain, and Royal Copenhagen is the result of that, Royal Copenhagen porcelain. In France, the government, I think Louis XIV first promoted the Sèvres China factory to make china specifically for government and royal purposes. During the French Revolution, after Napoleon had taken over, he supported that. He continued to fund that factory. And every French government since to this day does that. The same happened in Austria and Spain. That did not happen in England. What happened in England was more like the COVID thing, where you had rival pottery makers in different parts of the country trying to come up with the formula. And the first one who did it that we really know of now, there were some earlier ones in the mid-18th century, but the very end of the 18th century was Josiah Spode, who had a factory in Stoke-on-Trent. His big pal was another Josiah Wedgwood, also had a factory in Stoke-on-Trent. They were both working on the same stuff at the same time. much like Pfizer and Moderna were working on the same stuff at the same time, and they both got it out at the same time. Spode was just a bit faster than Wedgwood. And their innovation was to include ground up bones in the mixture for making the china. And so that ground up bones made it extremely strong. And that's why in England and in America, we tend not to use the word porcelain. We use the word china. Partly because it comes from China and because all English china at the bottom will be marked bone china. And roughly speaking, bone china has 50% of bones in the constituent. Most of those bones nowadays come from South America. And most of the bones are from cows and bulls. So they're heavy bones, and that makes bone china very strong. It's stronger than porcelain. You can drop it and bash it about, and it'll take a lot of hard work before it cracks. So that's the difference between bone china and porcelain. But of course, when you think of some of those two companies I just mentioned, and there are many more, Spode and Wedgwood, that is again an enormous economic impact of tea drinking and coffee drinking, that those major European industries got going entirely to accommodate it, entirely to deal with that big change. It's worth noting too that in England, because these individual businessmen were essentially competing with each other to produce china, they needed a mass market. They'd got they had no financial support behind them. So they needed a mass market, and loads of English people were drinking tea, so there they had it. But that meant that the china was bone china, Wedgwood, Spode. They produced fancy stuff. They produced very plain stuff as well. But that meant that it was oriented towards a mass market, whereas the china, the served china in France or Royal Copenhagen, was supported by the king and the government, and it ended up being more oriented towards a prestigious aristocratic market, and also often more oriented towards decorative items, such as figurines, rather than practical items such as teacups and teapots. So there's a continuing difference in the effect that tea had there. Now, I have found my list of that ship's order from the early 17th century. This is from 1709, and he wanted 40 tons of the undermentioned, or if the quantity should amount to more, yet bring it as being heavy goods, is what the sea captain said. In other words, he would weigh his ship down. He wanted 50,000 teacups, 50,000 saucers, 5,000 teapots, 5,000 small deep plates for the teapots, 8,000 milk pots, 12,000 boats for the teaspoons, 2,000 small tea canisters, 3,000 sugar dishes, and 3,000 bowls of about 3 pints. But you can see that suddenly getting this kind of order, and not just from one ship, but from many ships, was also provoked a big economic boom in China too. I noticed that list includes milk pots and sugar dishes. The Chinese didn't drink milk or put sugar in their tea. So what they were doing, they were producing milk pots and sugar dishes entirely for the European and later the American market. That is what we call Chinese export China, because it wasn't stuff they needed to use themselves. So again, a big economic boost from this development in drinking. and not just in England, I'm concentrating on England and America for obvious reasons. At different times, another kind of economic boost occurred, and one of which was American. And that is that the English were sending these, they were called Indiamen. These were boats, ships going to China, and they were very big and very heavy and very clunky. And it was a very successful business for a long time, hundreds of years, so they didn't change the ships. Then Americans got into the business and they built a fast ship called the tea clippers, and they could get to China and get back with the tea harvest in 3 or 4 months. That was an enormous economic impetus because it cut the price of tea by cutting the journey time. Well, and speaking of American contributions to the tea business, here are 2 more. One is iced tea that was invented in America for the 1903 World's Fair by a caterer who knew that people wouldn't buy hot tea in the summer. So he came up with iced tea, and we know that's so popular today. The other comes from about the 1920s, when Thomas Sullivan, who was a tea merchant in New York, decided to send his tea samples around in little silk bags. The people who received these silk bags of tea thought this was a new way to have tea, and it saved the mess of tea leaves in the sink. So they put the bag into the cup and they made the tea that way. So that's how the tea bag took off, and is now, I think, in Europe and America, the most commonest way to drink tea. So I think so far I've tried to cover some of the economic impacts of tea and the social impacts of tea. And as Charlene mentioned before, this is the subject of my book. Do we have time for any more?
I think we're at a point where we should do questions.
Okay,
So,
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's open it up to questions,
Mhm.
and we'll see what people would like to say.
There we go. Did we get Donna? Oops.
Whoops, unmute.
Donna, go ahead, Donna.
When did herbal infusions begin to be called tea? Because herbal infusions, let's say chamomile or mint or lemon verbena, could have been grown before tea was even produced in these countries. But nowadays, I mean, I drink a lot of mint tea and I drink chamomile and I call it tea, but when did it start being called tea?
They're going to come and take me. Simon will go with me. And you know how much it costs? $3 or $4. I don't know why the town just doesn't do it for everybody.
What?
Anyway, I'm going to get my second.
What?
I can't hear the question very clearly.
No. Could I repeat it?
I couldn't hear the question.
So she can talk.
She is.
Okay.
I couldn't hear the question clearly, but I think it was about
Herbal
I think it was about infusions like chamomile or lemon verbena. Are they tea?
Right.
And the answer is no.
There's an echo.
Because tea is one specific plant, like chamomile is one specific plant, or hibiscus is one specific plant. So tea is one specific plant. And I think it is best, if you're drinking lemon verbena, to use the word you used, infusion, or maybe the French word tisane, because that indicates that it's a, it's a beverage made of that plant, and another beverage made from a plant is tea. So to me, they are not teas. They are, like you said, infusions. Was that Susan? I can see Susan has a hand up.
Unmute.
Mute.
I can't hear.
She's muted.
Mute, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Is green tea considered tea? I mean.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, just, so it's the same.
It's the
Yeah.
same plant. The
Plant.
difference, and it's an important thing actually, because the Chinese kept everything secret. So for 200 or 300 years, people were bringing all this tea back to Europe. They had never seen a tea plant, and this is because they were restricted. The merchants and the captains were restricted to the coastal areas, and tea was growing on the Himalayas. So they never saw a tea plant, and they thought that green tea was one thing and black tea was another. They're the same plant, and they have to be picked by taking the top leaves from a stalk, and then very quickly the green leaves are dried so they don't oxidize. And so they stay green. But if it's going to be black tea, they deliberately bruise the leaves and break them, and they leave them out in the sun. So the leaves, as you can imagine with any plant really, they begin to turn black. And then when they've turned black, they dry them in a kind of a roaster. They actually heat them, and that dries them out, and that gives us the black tea. And it looks and tastes quite different from green tea. So the idea that people had, they were looking for two plants here, was wrong. It's just two methods of processing the same thing. And oolong tea is a tea that starts out being treated like a green tea and then finishes up being treated like a black tea. So it has some elements of both. And lapsang souchong is a tea that in the roasting process of the leaves is allowed to smoke. So it gets a smoky flavor. But though that's all processing, it's not a difference in plants.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
What
There was a
about
big thing in the beginning of the 19th century for American and European botanists to go to the Himalayas collecting plants, and they brought back many flowers like chrysanthemums and dahlias and all sorts of flowers that we have in our gardens today. But they also began looking for a tea plant because people got fed up with buying it from China, but they didn't know what they were looking for. So this whole thing was a big problem that took a lot of solution to find out how were they making this tea, what was the plant like? I had no idea. If you imagine some tea leaves such as you get at home, and now you're trying to find the plant that they came from, that would be quite hard. And so they didn't know until about 1830.
Do we grow tea in the United States? Is there the climate suitable?
I think there's been attempts. There's been attempts to grow it, and I think maybe somewhat successful in North Carolina. And similarly in England, there is a tea company in Cornwall, which is the bit of England southwest England that sticks out into the Atlantic. It's a very rainy part of England, but not particularly cold. Well, rain's cold, but it doesn't freeze particularly. So that there have been attempts. But the big producers nowadays are still China, India, Kenya, all grown in mountainous places in those countries. Turkey grows quite a lot of tea, also Vietnam.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating.
Hi. I am from Turkey and I grew up with tea.
And tea, like in England, is a big social event. And women entertain each other, mostly other women, in late afternoon tea parties at their home with beautiful linens on the table and nice pastries. I mean, very, very nice. And they serve tea. But of course, before they serve tea, they serve their guests Turkish coffee. And Turkish coffee
Yes.
is drank in very small demi-tasse cups. And after about an hour or so, then they serve the tea. And I was just waiting for our Zoom meeting. I was brewing tea. And this is a cup, a small pot. You put the tea leaves in it. And you boil water on a bigger pot. And then when the water in the hot kettle is hot, then you pour over into this. And then you let it brew and turn the heat down very low, let it brew like about 10 minutes at least. And then you drink, in Turkey, you drink the tea from very small teacups. They're always glass. And you put like maybe, depending on the taste, whether you like it strong or weak, you add from this brewing pot a little bit, and then you top it with hot water. Like I like my tea strong, so I fill my cup with half this very strong tea, the brew tea, and then I dilute it with hot water. And then they have lots of tea houses scattered all over the cities. And at the time I grew up in Turkey, it was mainly used by men. Women didn't used to go to those tea houses. And in those tea houses, they serve Turkish coffee and Turkish tea. And unlike the British tea drinkers, we only add sugar or drink it plain. We never add milk into that. So I just thought I'll give a little version of the Turkish tea. And yes, they grow lots of tea in Turkey, and they grow it mainly on the north part of the country, which is opens to the Black Sea, and it's very mountainous and it has lots of rainfall. I don't know if that is important for the climate where they grow tea. Just
Yeah,
wanted.
I visited Turkey too, and I like the way that often in shops, when you go in a shop, they will give you a cup of tea, but they don't always, they're not always making the tea in the shops. So they send out to a tea place for it. And so they have special trays, like round with a rim, so the cups won't fall off, and a handle. Right. So there's always people running up and down the street taking tea or one place to another. I think in this country, we know Turkey for coffee. I mean, that's well known, Turkish coffee.
Yes.
But we don't think of tea quite so much. But as you say, when you go to Turkey, it's very obvious that Turks really are big tea drinkers.
And it's not very common to drink the coffee we drink here right now, although it's getting more popular there. But before, coffee was a Turkish coffee. And a very interesting thing is when you go shopping, especially in the covered bazaar in Istanbul, before you go into a carpet store or jewelry store or something, the first thing they ask you, would you like to have tea or coffee? Immediately they call these people who come and bring you coffee or tea. Interesting variations between different cultures.
Yeah.
Do we have any other?
Are there any more questions?
I'll just make a comment that was a fabulous presentation.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, good. Thank
It was
you.
absolutely fascinating. All the detail, I mean, all the things.
Charlene is encouraging me to show you my book,
Ah,
which I hope you can see is called The History of Tea. And there's a cup on the front with a very famous tea party from Alice in Wonderland. But most of what I've said is pulled from my book. And also, as Charlene said before, the theory of the book was that we could learn a lot from how tea is presented in books about the social and personal significance of tea, whereas formal history often concentrates on statistical figures of trade and so on and so forth. So here's my book. If anybody would like a copy, you can get it from me by Charlene will give you my email address, and I will be happy to deliver it you or send it you through the mail. And it's $15 a copy. So if there are no more questions, that is, I'll say goodbye. and
Thank you.
Send you back to
Thank
Charlene.
you. Thank you.
Hi there, that was a real treat. We really learned so much. I've learned all kinds of things that I had assumptions about that were really, really interesting. I'd like to thank Claire, and I have also a Women's Club mug for Claire as a gift, which I'm sure she won't put tea in because no real tea drinker drinks out of a mug. So we've already talked about that, and she and I agreed that it's porcelain cups that you have to really drink good tea out of. So I'd like to also mention that Claire will be doing some speaking coming up in March. She'll be at the Springfield Museum of Fine Arts, and it's on March 30th, Saturday at 10 a.m. in the morning, and she'll be talking about syrups. And there is a question about whether that date is going to be set in stone because of the weather or because of COVID. So look for it and go on to their website at the Springfield Museums, and hopefully you can tune in. Also on June 5th at 10 a.m., there is a coffee, which I believe Claire said is done in person in their atrium.
Yeah, in the loggia of one of the museums.
The loge of one of the museums.
The talk is coffee, and that one, since we can use the loggia, is not so influenced by the weather.
Oh, yes. So it'll be later in June, and the weather should be good. And so hopefully people can join in with that. And again, check the website of the Springfield Museum. Our thanks to Claire, and I'm going to give this back to Catherine, and she may have a few words to say. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed your tea.
We really thank Charlene and Claire for putting all of that together. I want to remind you that our next meeting is March the 8th, and we're going to have an interesting poet and author, and the topic is writing the story of our lives. All of us have a story to tell, and maybe we'll get a few tips on how to get it down. Certainly before our grandchildren forget all about the family stories. So thank you all for joining us. It's been a wonderful large size group. The meeting is over, but unmute yourself if you would like to stay longer and talk. We'll leave the link on for a few minutes. Personally, I would just like to say that I loved Emily and her daughter with the Mad Hatter hat on. I thought that was a great thing to add to the. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Great. Love it.
excellent.
Yeah. Really good.
So if you want to stay, oh, there, our picture is back finally. Oops, where did it go? Oops, there it is. We have to sort of show, kind of hold it up, hold the camera up And you can see that the
Oh.
table that they,
Oh, wow.
tea table that they arranged.
Oh, wait, it's gone, I think.
No, I see it. I see it. And I'm
It's
sitting
on one
here
of the screens.
thinking about it.
Can you
Oh,
make
I
it on the full screen?
Well, that's an,
Oh, very nice. I tapped it, got a full screen. Yes.
that's
The
an
cake,
after.
There.
the cake is looking totally delicious.
Oh, I'll have one of each.
Yes.
I'm hungry.
Now I know the difference between afternoon tea and high tea.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's terrific.
I like those cucumber sandwiches.
Yeah. Oh, and
Beautiful.
everything looks yummy, yummy, yummy.
Absolutely.
Who made the
You know,
table?
one of our members talked about the fact that a number of historic places like Porter Phelps Huntington do afternoon teas and charge for them. And one of our members made a suggestion that maybe that's something that we could do in the nice weather. We have the beautiful porch as well as our beautiful living room here. And it might be something to link up with the Emily Dickinson House with once they get back to their tours. So it's just food for thought.
Yes.
I have a lot of napkins and tablecloths from when I did an event at the Amherst Women's Club for my mother's memorial, which I don't use. So I would, if we ever did a big public tea, I do have some linens that I can, we can use.
Lovely.
So I think that would be
Lovely.
great to do. I think it would be a real fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
All very much.
So was Charlene the baker?
No, Claire was the baker.
Oh boy, it just looks wonderful.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so when you guys want to leave, just turn yourself off. I will not cut everybody off until a lot of you have left. Right. So keep on talking if you wish to.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
Bye, and thank you again.
Thank you
Bye.
all for being here.